And so really, all we have left now is the very end of the play. We've seen Macbeth put all of his confidence in those witches and their prophecies. We've seen him say that nobody's going to harm him who was not born of woman. When Macduff and Macbeth fight in Act 5, Scene 8, we find out that, in fact, Macduff was not born of woman in the natural way. And so there goes that prophecy. We find out when we see Malcolm tell all the soldiers to hew you down a bough, cut down a bough, and march up the hill to Dunsinane. That, in fact, it looks like the woods are marching up the hill to Dunsinane. So that prophecy is gone. Macbeth holds, he says, I'll hold to the last. That last one being, beware Macduff. And he and Macduff fight. And they fight to the death. Macbeth says, I don't really want to fight you. I have too much blood of yours already on my hands. Of course, if he had gone ahead and killed him, then it would have been over with, but he chose not to. That gives him the opening. That one last act of his natural being is what actually then does him in the end. Think about that. And then we go to scene, or the end of that scene. Macbeth and Macduff do fight to the death. And after that happens off stage. One more murder off stage. The final death of Macbeth happens off stage. Malcolm comes in and he says, I would the friends we miss were safe arrived. Seward says, some must go, and yet by these I see so great a day as this is cheaply bought. It was worth everything that it's cost us, which really didn't cost all that much to most people. To old Seward, it cost him his son. And so that was the greatest casualty of that particular battle. Malcolm says Macduff is missing. They assume then that he is fighting Macbeth. And that's when he finds out that his son has died. At the very end of the play, Macduff comes in. He's holding Macbeth's head. And he says, Hail King, speaking to Malcolm, for so thou art. Here stands the usurper's cursed head. The time is free. We are free again. I see thee compassed with thy kingdom's pearl, that speak my salutation in their minds, whose voices I desire aloud with mine. Hail, King of Scotland. He says everybody here has the look on their face that is the look that we have been desiring, and that is of the true and the right king being on the throne of Scotland, and now we can all rest. Malcolm makes some decisions as his first as king, and he does that in his final speech. After they hail him King of Scotland, he says, we shall not spend a large expense of time before we reckon with your several loves and make us even with you. We will not spend a lot of time before we get down to the business of being king. My thanes and kinsmen henceforth be earls, the first that ever Scotland in such an honor named. Now, he changes the name then from thane to earl. The implication here is actually for King James sitting in the audience, that he makes this change in the blend of Scotland and England for King James, who has now become the Scottish king, who is now the new English king. And what's more to do, which would be planted newly with the time, is calling home our exiled friends abroad that fled the snares of watchful tyranny. All those people who have left Scotland for other places because they were trying to be safe, we're going to call them all home. We're going to create the Scotland that we wanted earlier. Producing forth the cruel ministers, he refers now to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as this dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. And think about them from the very beginning. Macbeth was anything but the type of tyrant that he turned out to be. He was, however, a butcher. Remember that scene where his blade was smoking in bloody execution. And Lady Macbeth, when we first meet her, is somewhat fiend-like, because she does call on those evil spirits to fill her up so that she can do what she needs to do. Who, we find out here how Lady Macbeth died, who, as 'tis thought, by self and violent hands took off her life. So suicide was considered for many, many years, and still in some religious beliefs today, that suicide is an ultimate sin that will not be forgiven. That when you commit suicide, it condemns you to eternal damnation without opportunity to go to heaven. So they would believe that about Lady Macbeth. What needful else that calls upon us by the grace of grace, we will perform in measure, time, and place. And here we go with the final couplet of the play. So thanks to all at once and to each one whom we invite to see us crowned at Scone. And remember the last time we saw Scone, it was when Macbeth was headed to Scone to be crowned king. And that's the end of the play. Now all of that is plot. All that's a great story. But there are things that run throughout this play. There are those motifs that we've been noticing throughout. The blood, the night and day, the clothing, the sleep and the lack of sleep. All of those things that that Shakespeare has used. And why does he use those things over and over? What is he trying to do as he uses those throughout the play? Well, one of the things that he's trying to do is to show us this common thread. When he uses blood over and over and over, he's trying to remind us that this is not pure entertainment. This is a bloody business. This idea of being king has life and death implications, and a good king will recognize that it could go just as badly for you as it could go well for you, and you need to be aware of that. When he uses that clothing, this is something that ruling, you can take it on and you can put it off. Life, titles, all of these things really don't mean very much. It's just like clothing, which sometimes fits and sometimes doesn't. Sometimes is old and sometimes is new, but can be cast aside. These titles, these positions, what really matters is the man. And we see that Macbeth was the kind of man, he knew his own nature, and his own nature was to not do these things. But he goes against his nature. And when he goes against his nature, his own true nature, this is how it turns out. Don't you think that Shakespeare is trying to tell us that? That Macbeth has put on the wrong kind of clothes. He is doing things under cover of night. He has become what we as human beings should not. And through these motifs, through these common threads throughout the play, Shakespeare is giving a clear message to all of us who are readers. When you become something that you're not, when you step over into the dark side, when you do these things that are clearly not in your nature to do, that you're becoming somebody that it's not going to go well for you. It's not going to work out the way you think it's going to work out, and there are going to be repercussions, and you're going to have to pay in the end for that kind of aberration in your own nature. So that's what he's doing with these motifs. He's reminding us, he's connecting them to the theme. Now, remember who's sitting in the audience. Who was this play written for? It was, of course, inspired by and written for the new King of England, King James I, who had previously been King James VI of Scotland, who followed after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. And what do you think that Shakespeare was saying to King James, who's sitting in that audience? Well, he gives him in one scene, he lists when Malcolm and Macduff are together. He says, these are the kingly virtues. Find that scene and look. He lays it out. Here's, if you want to be a bad king, here's how you're a bad king. If you want to be a good king, here are the kingly virtues. Here's how to be a good king. If you try to be too ambitious, this is how that turns out. If you don't trust the people around you, this is how that turns out. If you don't follow and listen to the people around you, this is how that turns out. Over and over and over. He shows us in this play. He's showing King James in this play. If you want to be the kind of king that people will love, people will honor, people will respect, where you will have the support of your nation, this is the kind of king that you need to be. You need to do things in the light of day. Don't have this secrecy about you. Queen Elizabeth was a very hard act to follow. And I think Shakespeare was trying to say to James, look to that model. Look to that openness. We're in a time where things are changing. They lived in a time of exploration. They lived in a time when new worlds were being discovered and named. Our own country was one of those. And Shakespeare might be saying, this is a new time. It's a new opportunity for a new kind of rule. And here it is. And he tells that through this play to James. If we are wise, we'll listen to it too. We'll listen maybe not to the part about being kings and queens, because that's not in our cards. But we'll listen to the part about being true to our nature, trying not to do things under a cloak of secrecy, being able to sleep, the rest that Macbeth so desired but could not have because his conscience was so disturbed by the things that he had done. You need to be able to sleep at night. King James, you need to be able to sleep at night. And so we do too. So all of these lessons from the play, The Tragedy of Macbeth,